Are there 7 deadly sins in Islam?
AlMaghrib Institute presents Q&A with Ammar Alshukry.
The Islamic tradition is different than the Christian tradition with regards to 7 deadly sins. That phrase is Christian. The Prophet ﷺ didn't tell us about 7 deadly sins, but he said as-sab'a al-mubiqat, the 7 mortal sins. And so the 7 deadly sins in Christianity is like wrath and greed. But the Prophet ﷺ, when he mentions avoid the 7 mubiqat, the 7 mortal sins, and this is a hadith that's reported by Bukhari and Muslim, it's highly authentic, it's the highest level of authenticity actually. The Prophet ﷺ says, number 1, ash-shirk, associating partners with Allah. Associating partners with Allah is the greatest sin in Islam, and it's the only sin that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promises He will never forgive on the Day of Judgment, no matter what. Everybody else, every other sin that a person may appear in front of Allah with on the Day of Judgment could be forgiven. Allah says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَغْفِرُ أَن يُشْرَكَ بِهِ وَيَغْفِرُ مَا دُونَ ذَلِكَ لِمَن يَشَاءُ. Allah says Allah will not forgive that partners be associated with Him. And He will forgive whatever is less than that to whomever He will. So if a person may come on the Day of Judgment with murder or with drinking alcohol or with usury or with theft or with anything, Allah may simply forgive that person on the Day of Judgment. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive us all. But shirk, Allah promises He will never forgive. That's the greatest. Number 2, secondly, the Prophet ﷺ mentions as-sihr, magic. Why magic? When we talk about magic, we're not talking about sleight of hands. We're not talking about illusions. We're talking about real magic, and that is something that involves the worship of the jinn, worshipping other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and obedience to them. Number 3, the Prophet ﷺ mentions qatl al-nafs, killing of a soul. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and whoever kills a believing soul intentionally, then they will have Jahannam, they will be there eternally, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's curse will be upon them and His anger, and He has prepared for them painful punishment. And so the killing of a soul is something that is a great sin, of the greatest of sins. Number 4, the Prophet ﷺ says, aklu riba, the eating of usury. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Baqarah, O you who believe, leave interest, and whoever does not do so, then be forewarned of a war from Allah and His Messenger. And so riba is the only thing in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has declared war on the people who do it. Number 5, the consuming of the wealth of an orphan. The orphan in their state of weakness, that the person who consumes their wealth is one of the greatest sins, because the consuming of the wealth of someone who is able to defend themselves is not like consuming the wealth and taking the wealth of someone who is completely defenseless, and who is more defenseless than a child who is without the protection of their father. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says those who consume the wealth of the orphan, إِنَّمَا يَأْكُلُونَ فِي بُطُونِهِمْ نَارًا, that they are actually eating or consuming in their bellies fire. Allah is threatening those who consume the wealth of the orphan. And number 6, the Prophet ﷺ says, at-tawalli yawm az-zahf, the person who flees from the battlefield when the two armies meet, and a soldier forsakes his brethren in arms and leaves them to be surrounded by the enemy or to be harmed. That person, that is of the greatest sins. And then the last one, the Prophet ﷺ says, وَقَذْفَ الْمُحْصَنَاتِ الْمُؤْمِنَاتِ الْغَافِلَاتِ, that a person accuse and slander chaste, unaware Muslim women, right? And so believing women. And so these are the 7 mortal sins that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned. As for what is a major sin versus a minor sin, we're going to discuss that in the class, what the scholars have mentioned regarding them. But these 7 are what the Prophet ﷺ told us to avoid because of how evil they are and how destructive they are.